I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight, we're talking about an important piece of historical fiction that will transport you back to another time, another era. It is called Mary Quigley's Da, a tragedy of an Irish immigrant couple and their children caught on the Kansas-Missouri border during the Civil War. It is written by Mary Jaffe, and we are delighted to have her here on Spotlight today. And we'd like to thank the folks at Good River Print and Media for helping us put Mary in the spotlight today. Mary, thank you so much for being our guest.
I'm delighted to have been invited. Thank you.
My pleasure. I love your book. It really does transport you back. I said to you before when we were off camera that it feels like you've lived through that era, that you were alive back in 1849. Now, we know that's not true, but you...
I have to tell you that I'm kind of a method actress. I lived it as I read the history. And I had very profound feelings about that time and other times in history. But that I've always wanted to transport myself into other people's shoes. And so I become that. And I tell you, I spent my entire life trying to either mentally or in reality writing that story.
Well, it shows that you put that kind of heart, that kind of research, that kind of focus on the work, because it's just terrific. For the folks at home, tell them briefly what your book is about.
My book is about a family of 10 who came to this country through attrition by death or a disease or necessity. We end up with only two brothers who are adolescents, one's 12, one's 19, who then have to find a life because their family is gone. They're basically orphans at this point. And they move across the country. The older brother has skills, and they find themselves then on the Kansas-Missouri border after several years, struggling, thriving how they can. And then it dissolves ultimately into a tragic event. When I was a child, I used to hear this story when I was an infant that my grandmother was made an orphan. That would be the daughter of one of the two brothers who came, and that would be Joseph Quigley and his brother Michael. But I heard that story of my grandmother not only became an orphan with her 6 siblings, but there were 5 siblings other than herself, but she had lost a 4-month-old infant sister. And it didn't make any sense. How can you lose a 4-month-old baby when you're only 9 years old yourself? And the story was she cried every day. She prayed every day to find that baby. And in doing the research that I did when I was 9, I said to my grandmother, whom I did not know, she is already deceased, that I would find her infant sister. In 2012, I found that infant sister for my grandmother. And I found where she was buried. She's buried in Woodlawn Cemetery, just a few miles south of Independence, Missouri. And by finding an infant sister, I put 40 years of mystery, shame, and history to bed. And this story is what happened ultimately to that family to cause them to be disintegrated.
Amazing. It's an amazing epic tale for sure. And it also reminds us of how many people were impacted by the potato famine. We have more Irish in this country today than in Ireland because so many came here because they were poverty stricken over there.
You wouldn't believe it, but Butte, Montana is about 60-some% Irish because of mining. But I have a blog on my website, and I explore. I started finding immigrants in the 1600s, Irish immigrants who came from Barbados into the Carolinas. And then I learned about the difference between the prisoners who were sent to what was called the West Indies then, and actual immigrants, the indentured servants then. And then when the penal laws were instituted between 16 to 1700 Ireland, then the immigrants began to come in who were professional Irish, and they came in through either Philadelphia or through New York or through Canada. And the first Quigleys came at that time into Canada. And the professionals came then because of the penal laws in which people couldn't teach their own children. The Catholics, Irish Catholics, couldn't teach school. They couldn't own a horse that was worth more than 10 pounds. They couldn't own anything. Yeah. Any Irish person who had property had to divide it into 4 segments. They could stay on one of those 4. They had to surrender. Those were appropriated by the English. And then they became indentured servants or renters on their own property after that. And that went on until the 1900s. But there's a very cruel history of the Irish.
It's an incredible story. It's incredible hardship that the Irish had to bear. Now, part of your preparation for writing this book was your career. You were a teacher as well, correct? Tell me a little bit about your work as a teacher.
But I was a journalism and an English teacher. And I also taught in prison. I implemented a GED college prep program in one of the prisons, but I taught basic education and GED in another. And but I was an opera singer. I took care of my husband for 17 years, but I always did genealogical research. So I have over 30,000 people on my family tree. Wow. And by doing that genealogical research, I just learned more than you could ever imagine. And anybody that I found who was even slightly interesting, I would read a history book, either a local history or, whatever.
Amazing. It's amazing. I don't know if you did it through one of the websites, through Amazon, through Ancestry or something like that. But
I did it at the very beginning when Ellis Island first came on. I started. My husband was Russian Jewish, and his family was destroyed with the pogroms and the Holocaust. And his mother came over in 1913. And when Ellis Island site started, I started helping him do genealogy because I had been doing my own. But I was doing it when you had to sit in a library and look through archives and, look up documents. There was no website. And of course, the minute Ancestry came on board, we took our DNA tests and the 2-point test that was being done through from London. I can't think of his name. It starts with a C. Anyway, but I went on Ancestry then. But my family was very easy to find, except for the Irish, because the Scots came in the. My 6th great-grandfather was a parliamentarian in Scotland who had fought with the king and was sent to Ireland. And then he came with his children to this country, to William Penn's Scots-Irish and Scottish settlement in Pennsylvania. But he was, my 4th great-grandfather was George Washington's surgeon, Matthew Scott. He was the first soldier in America ever traded in a war, in the Battle of Long Island. That family started Princeton University. John Scott gave his property. So all of the people on that side of the family that were generals, I'm related to Ulysses Grant, who is a first cousin on my father's side. And a first cousin on my mother's side was General Schofield, who coincidentally was sent to the border by Lincoln to settle the disputes in 1860 and before then. And my grandfather had grown up, was a young adult then. And then I discovered that General Schofield, my first cousin, actually trained my great-grandfather, Quigley. And of course, they didn't know that, 4 generations later, they would have a granddaughter in common.
Amazing. It's amazing when you delve into the family history, what you can find, what kind of connections you can find. What was it like for you writing this book? Was it a labor of love?
It was a painful experience because I started so early and I got so frustrated. And the first thing I ever found was a newspaper article from the Bazoo from Sedalia, Missouri, about a crazy guy who did this crazy thing. And the journalist who wrote that story thought it was amusing. To us, it was a family tragedy. So when I read, and I would cry over this, my grandmother, and when I read that article about actually what happened for the first time, it absolutely gobsmacked me because it was written in humor, and it was for our family a lifelong tragedy and a source of shame and grief. And that, you know, sort of opened the floodgates, I would say, in terms of my emotion about this story. Another thing that made me very emotional about the story is that one of my nephews, he's a brilliant kid, he's a writer, but he was doing stand-up comedy, and he used this event in a humorous way himself because he didn't know the facts of the story. Right. And I was even more committed then to say, how dare everybody find humor in this horrendous act that just destroyed my grandmother, just really it made her whole life sad. She was a wonderful, delightful, funny woman, but at the soul, you know, she was very impacted. I was impacted by the entire journey of everything and learning the history and learning how connected I was in so many different ways to the events of the history. I didn't realize all those things about my family and how invested they were in those times and in the slavery issue. One of my Scott great grand uncles was an abolitionist. He was a minister, and he had a station on the railroad, which I thought was amazing. That was in Ohio. He was a professor at the University of Miami. It was those abolitionist activities that got him fired at his university. But anyway, on the Underground Railroad is what I was trying to say. Anyway, but yeah, it impacted me.
I'm sure. Well, it's an amazing book. It's called Mary Quigley's Da, a tragedy of an Irish immigrant couple and their children caught on the Kansas-Missouri border during the Civil War. It is written by Mary Jaffe, and you can get it online and enjoy this book and all of the hard work that she has put into it. It is an incredible story. Mary, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity. Greatly, I appreciate.
My pleasure. Appreciate your time and your insight. And to the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.